In early 1942, the Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra was not just a narrow body of water, it was one of the few remaining exits from the collapsing Allied position in the Netherlands East Indies. Since December 1941, Japanese forces had advanced southward from bases in Indochina and Formosa, seizing Hong Kong, large parts of the Philippines, British Malaya, and Singapore. In the Netherlands East Indies, Japanese landings on Borneo, Celebes, and Sumatra progressively cut Allied oil supplies and naval bases off from each other. By late February, the main Japanese objective in the region was the island of Java, with its airfields, ports, and administrative centers, and with it, control of the central arc between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. To defend this area, the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command, ABDA, had been created in January 1942 under British General Archibald Wavell. Naval forces from 4 countries were assembled in the Java Sea, Dutch cruisers and destroyers familiar with regional waters, British and Australian cruisers recently transferred from other theaters, and American cruisers and destroyers that had withdrawn from the Philippines. This multinational force, commanded at sea by Dutch Rear Admiral Karel Doorman, was tasked with intercepting Japanese invasion convoys approaching Java from the north and west. However, the component navies differed in doctrines, communications procedures, and operational experience in night actions, and they operated with limited air cover against an opponent that combined carrier aviation, land-based bombers, and a strong surface fleet. On 27 February 1942, Doorman's combined striking force of 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers engaged a Japanese escort group in the Battle of the Java Sea. Over the course of a protracted, confused action, the Allied force lost 2 Dutch cruisers, 1 British cruiser, and 2 Dutch destroyers, while the surviving ships expended much of their ammunition and fuel. The Japanese maintained their escort screen and continued closing on Java. Among the few major Allied units still operational at the end of that day were the Australian light cruiser, HMAS Perth, and the American heavy cruiser, USS Houston, Perth, a modified Leander-class cruiser of about 6,800 tons with 8 6-inch guns, and Houston, a 9,050-ton Northampton-class cruiser with 9 8-inch guns, of which only 6 remained in service after earlier damage, had already been under frequent air attack in previous weeks. For the Japanese, the Sunda Strait formed part of the western approach to Java. Their plan for the invasion, designated Operation J, divided the landing force into eastern and western convoys, carrying roughly 40,000 troops in total. The western invasion force, which concerned Perth and Houston, departed Cam Ranh Bay on the 18th of February 1942 with 56 transports carrying the bulk of the Japanese 16th Army, including the 2nd Infantry Division and elements of the 38th Division. Its objective was to put troops ashore in western Java, at points such as Bantam Bay and Merak, in order to move rapidly on Batavia and Bandung. Heavy and light cruisers, destroyer flotillas, and auxiliary vessels, including a light carrier and a seaplane tender, screened these transports as they moved toward the Sunda Strait approaches. Civilian populations on Java and Sumatra experienced this phase of the war through air raids, fuel shortages, and disrupted shipping, rather than through naval engagements themselves. Dutch colonial authorities attempted to maintain order in urban centers like Batavia and Bandung, while evacuating non-essential personnel and records from threatened ports. Indonesian civilians saw both colonial and Japanese forces as external powers. Some local groups anticipated that the collapse of Dutch rule might open political opportunities, while others focused on immediate concerns such as food supply, employment, and the danger of bombardment near coastal towns. Merchant crews from multiple nations, operating tankers and freighters in and out of Tanjung Priok and other ports, navigated an increasingly hazardous environment of mines, submarines, and air attack as the front drew closer. By late February, Allied Naval Command on Java received intelligence that Japanese invasion convoys were approaching from multiple directions. Air reconnaissance and radio intercepts suggested one major group converging on eastern Java and another advancing toward the western end of the island. The Sunda Strait, normally a commercial route linking the Java Sea to the Indian Ocean, now appeared both as a likely path for Japanese movements and as the only practical escape corridor for damaged Allied ships seeking to reach Australian or Indian ports. Yet information about exact convoy positions, escort strength, and timing was incomplete and occasionally contradictory, reflecting the limited reconnaissance resources available after earlier airfield and base losses. In this setting, HMS Perth and USS Houston entered Tanjung Priok, the port of Batavia, on the afternoon of February 28, 1942. They had survived repeated engagements, but arrived low on ammunition for their main batteries and with only partial fuel reserves. Dutch port authorities, under pressure from continuing air raids and constrained oil stocks, could provide only limited refueling and no replacement for the heavy shells already fired. Senior Allied commanders on Java faced a difficult choice: retain these cruisers to contest further landings near Batavia with depleted resources, or attempt to withdraw them through the Sunda Strait to Cilacap on Java's south coast and beyond to Allied bases. Their decision, based on their reading of the wider situation and the expectation that the western route was still open, set the conditions for the night action that would follow in the waters off Bantam Bay and the mouth of the strait. In the late afternoon of February 28, 1942, Allied naval command around Java was in a state of reorganization rather than coherent defense. After the loss of most of the combined striking force in the Java Sea, the remaining American, British, Dutch, and Australian ships were being directed either to evacuate or to continue local resistance as individual units. On Java, Dutch Vice Admiral Conrad Helfrich retained formal authority over naval operations, but effective control of major surface forces had narrowed to a few surviving cruisers and destroyers. In this environment, decisions for each ship balanced between attempts to contest further Japanese landings and the need to preserve scarce units for future operations from bases to the south and west. At Tanjung Priok, the port of Batavia, HMAS Perth and USS Houston received orders that evening to leave Java by the western route. The directive instructed the cruisers, together with the Dutch destroyer HNLMS Evertsen, to proceed through the Sunda Strait to Cilacap on the south coast, and from there to continue toward Allied-controlled ports. Captain Hector Waller of Perth, as the senior officer present, took tactical command of the small group. Intelligence provided to the captains indicated that no major Japanese surface forces were expected in the strait, and that the only ships they might encounter would be Allied corvettes conducting patrol and escort duties. Material conditions on board the cruisers framed how they understood the risks. Perth had been able to take on only about half her normal fuel capacity, reducing her freedom to change speed and course repeatedly during any extended engagement. Ammunition stocks reflected the previous day's battle. Perth reportedly had about 160 rounds remaining for each of her 6-inch guns, while Houston's main battery was already reduced to 6 operational 8-inch guns after earlier bomb damage, with corresponding limits on heavy shell reserves. Anti-aircraft ammunition and torpedoes remained, but both ships were far from their designed combat load. These factors were known to their captains and senior officers when they weighed the choice between remaining in port or attempting passage. Perth, a light cruiser of roughly 6,800 tons standard displacement, carried a wartime complement of around 680 officers and ratings, organized into gunnery, torpedo, engineering, communications, and navigation departments. Houston, a heavy cruiser of about 9,050 tons, embarked more than 1,000 personnel, including Marine detachments and specialists who had already manned anti-aircraft guns, damage control parties, and command spaces in multiple actions since December 1941. On this sortie, there was no larger task force commander embarked. Waller on Perth and Captain Albert H. Rooks on Houston coordinated as peers within an improvised 2-cruiser formation. Linked by signal lamps and radio circuits, they attempted to keep silent to avoid detection. Around 1700 on 28 February, Perth and Houston cleared Tanjung Priok and turned northwest along the coast of Java, leaving Evertsen behind when the destroyer was delayed by preparations and did not complete her own fueling in time. The cruisers proceeded at about 20 to 22 knots, passing through Allied defensive minefields under local guidance before shaping course toward the entrance of the Sunda Strait. Their intended track would take them past the northern tip of Java, then between Java and Sumatra, and finally out into the Indian Ocean. The crews went to a heightened readiness state, but the ships did not yet remain at continuous action stations. Commanders still regarded the passage primarily as an evasion movement rather than as a deliberate attack. At almost the same time, the Japanese Western Java invasion convoy was converging on the same waters from the northwest. This formation consisted of about 56 transports carrying elements of the 16th Army, including headquarters staff, the bulk of the 2nd Infantry Division, and associated support units, in total several tens of thousands of troops. The convoy had sailed from Cam Ranh Bay on the 18th of February, and was now closing on planned landing beaches in Bantam Bay near Merak and along the northwestern coast of Java. Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura directed the Army component from on board one of the transports, while the naval escort remained under the control of Rear Admiral Kenzaburo Hara, operating within the structure of the Japanese Third Fleet. The escort for this convoy was proportioned to protect both against surface attack and against submarines and aircraft. Heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma and the light cruiser Notori formed part of the main covering force, with additional cruisers available at some distance. Destroyer divisions provided close screening. Units of the 5th Destroyer Flotilla shielded the transports in Bantam Bay, while destroyers of the 12th Division were posted in and near the Sunda Strait, including stations off Merak and along the approaches to the bay. Minesweepers and a mine layer supported the landing plan by ensuring safe channels and by securing anchorages for the transports once they arrived. Despite the scale of the Japanese convoy, neither side had a precise picture of the other's movements in the hours before contact. Allied assessments in Batavia suggested that the Western Java convoy remained to the north, and that the main body of its escort would likely guard the landing zone rather than patrol the strait itself. Japanese staff work, in turn, did not anticipate the presence of major Allied cruisers attempting passage from the west. Their focus lay on possible attacks from surviving units in the Java Sea and from submarines along the approach routes. As a result, the Allied cruisers entered the Sunda Strait, believing they might see only friendly patrol craft, while Japanese transports proceeded into Bantam Bay, assuming that the nearby sea lanes were largely secured. Shortly before midnight, this mutual miscalculation began to narrow. On the Japanese side, the destroyer Fubuki, patrolling on the outer screen north of Babi Island and the entrance to Bantam Bay, sighted unidentified warships approaching from the east. Her lookouts reported silhouettes consistent with cruisers, and she began to shadow the strangers while transmitting contact information back to the escort command. For the crews of Perth and Houston, the first signs that their passage would not be unopposed came in the form of lights and shapes at the edge of visibility ahead, suggesting other ships maneuvering in what had been assumed to be clear waters. Within minutes, standing orders for silent transit were overtaken by the need to identify potential opponents and prepare the cruisers and their mixed crews for another night engagement. In the hours before contact off the Sunda Strait, the events at sea reflected plans made days and weeks earlier, on land and in staff rooms. For the Japanese side, the Western Java invasion was part of a larger design to secure control over the Netherlands East Indies as a source of oil and as a shield for the approaches to the Japanese home islands. The seizure of airfields and ports on Java was expected to remove one of the last Allied bases from which bombers and submarines could threaten shipping moving between Southeast Asia and Japan. Within that framework, the landing in Bantam Bay was to establish a foothold in Western Java, from which Army formations could advance quickly on Batavia and Bandung and link with units coming ashore further east. Operational planning divided the Java invasion into eastern and western components, with separate convoys and escorts. The Western Invasion Force carried major elements of the Japanese 16th Army, including the 2nd Infantry Division and support units, in more than 50 transports. Its naval cover combined heavy cruisers, light cruisers, destroyer divisions, minesweepers, and auxiliary craft. The aim was not only to protect the transports during the sea passage, but also to maintain local sea control during the critical hours of unloading near Bantam Bay and Merak. staff officers allocated screening sectors, patrol lines, and mine clearance tasks, assuming that the main threat would come from submarines or small surface craft, rather than from a pair of cruisers forcing a passage from the Java coast. Japanese night fighting doctrine shaped how these escorts were arranged. Before the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy had invested in training for coordinated night attacks using destroyers, searchlights, and long-range Type 93 torpedoes. Exercises emphasized independent initiative by destroyer captains once contact was made, supported by heavy cruisers that could add gunfire and additional torpedoes. In planning for the Bantam landings, this doctrine translated into a layered screen: outer patrol destroyers in and near the Sunda Strait, closer escorts near the transports, and heavier units positioned to intervene if an enemy surface force appeared. The expectation was that, if Allied ships were encountered, they would be detected early and engaged with torpedoes and concentrated fire before they could threaten the main body of the convoy. On the Allied side, planning in late February 1942 had a different character. The ABDA Naval Command was no longer designing offensive operations. It was trying to manage a retreat from the Java Sea while preserving any remaining ships that could be used elsewhere. After the Java Sea battle, the surviving major units consisted chiefly of HMAS Perth and USS Houston in the western sector, and a few smaller ships attempting to reach southern ports. Decisions about their movements were made under pressure from limited fuel, damaged infrastructure, and air attack. The directive to send Perth and Houston through the Sunda Strait to Cilacap reflected an assumption that Java was no longer defensible as a base for heavy surface forces, and that these cruisers would be more useful if they could reach the Indian Ocean and link up with other Allied fleets. Within each ship, planning for the passage combined standing tactical doctrine with an assessment of their immediate situation. Both navies had experience with night steaming in formation, using dimmed navigation lights, radar if available, and sound discipline to avoid detection. However, Perth and Houston operated without the expectation of radar-assisted early warning equal to that on more modern ships. Their captains relied on lookouts, restricted radio use, and prearranged signals to maintain mutual awareness. Given their limited ammunition and fuel, they did not plan for a deliberate major engagement on the way out. Their internal orders emphasized transit through the strait, with the ability to respond if smaller enemy vessels appeared. Minefields and coastal defenses also entered planning on both sides. The Dutch had laid defensive mines near key ports, including minefields off Tanjung Priok and in certain approaches around Java. Perth and Houston had to pass safely through these with the help of local pilots and charts, adding constraints on their initial course and speed as they departed Batavia. Japanese staff, in contrast, anticipated possible Dutch defensive mining at Bantam Bay, and allocated minesweepers and a mine layer to clear approach channels and secure anchorages. For them, the critical period would be the hours when transports were stopped or moving slowly while landing troops. Their planning aimed to ensure that, by that point, any enemy surface threat in the vicinity would already have been neutralized or forced away. Communications planning highlighted differences in scale and integration. Japanese escort commanders could draw on an established communications network linking flagships, destroyer divisions, and individual patrol units, with radio circuits and signal procedures standardized across the fleet. This allowed convoy escort commanders to receive contact reports and issue orders rapidly once any unidentified ships were sighted. In contrast, Perth and Houston operated without immediate support from a larger formation or shore-based direction once they had cleared Tanjung Priok. They had access to Allied communication channels, but these were hampered by the disruption of command centers on Java and by the need to maintain radio silence to avoid drawing attention. For the personnel involved, strategic intention filtered down into routine. On the transports approaching Bantam Bay, Japanese soldiers of the 2nd Division and associated units spent the final hours before landing checking weapons, equipment loads, and disembarkation assignments. They had been briefed that opposition on the beaches was expected to be limited, with the main resistance likely further inland. On Perth and Houston, sailors and Marines prepared for a night transit that, according to their orders and intelligence, might pass without major contact. damage control parties reviewed their equipment, gunnery crews checked remaining ammunition, and bridge teams plotted the courses that would take the cruisers through the narrow waters of the Sunda Strait. As these parallel sets of intentions and plans unfolded, neither side fully appreciated how closely their movements would intersect. Japanese planners regarded the Sunda Strait primarily as a controlled gateway to landing beaches. Allied commanders viewed it as an escape corridor, still open on the map. The results of these differing assumptions would be determined not by high-level design alone, but by the specific positions and reactions of individual ships as they converged in darkness near Bantam Bay. When the first contacts were made near the Sunda Strait around 2315 to 2320 on 28 February 1942, the sequence of events at sea moved from planned transit into improvised combat. HMAS Perth led, with USS Houston following, both ships steaming west-northwest after clearing the northern coast of Java. Lookouts on Perth reported the lights of ships ahead and to starboard. Initial assumptions on the Allied side were that these might be small vessels or even local craft, consistent with earlier intelligence that no major Japanese surface force was expected in the area. Orders were given to close for identification while maintaining readiness to alter course if necessary. On the Japanese side, destroyers and patrol units deployed around the Western Java invasion convoy had already begun to detect unidentified silhouettes entering the approaches to Bantam Bay. Fubuki, one of the destroyers screening the northern side of the convoy, played a key role in this early phase. Her lookouts cited what they assessed as two cruisers approaching from the east. She reported this by radio to higher command and maneuvered to shadow the newcomers, maintaining distance while preparing to launch torpedoes if ordered. At the same time, transport columns were moving toward their assigned anchorage points in the bay, with navigation lights and some working lights still visible as they approached the landing area. As Perth closed the distance with the nearest cluster of ships, the bridge officers and gunnery teams realized that the silhouettes and light patterns did not match Allied vessels. Some ships ahead appeared larger and more heavily laden, consistent with transports, and others moved in screening patterns typical of escorts. Around 2330, having concluded that the ships ahead were Japanese, Captain Waller ordered Perth to open fire. Her 6-inch guns engaged the nearest large targets, and within minutes, Houston brought her remaining 8-inch guns to bear as well. Shells from the two cruisers struck several transports and smaller vessels in the vicinity of Bantam Bay, starting fires on at least one transport and creating confusion among ships that had not expected to be under surface attack at that stage of the approach. For the crews of the transports, the first awareness of battle came in the form of explosions and the sight of shells hitting nearby ships. Japanese soldiers and sailors on board had been preparing to disembark within hours onto landing craft. Instead, some found themselves fighting fires, manning improvised gun positions, or waiting in holds while damage control parties and medical teams moved through smoke and darkness. Commanders within the convoy were forced to balance the need to maintain station and proceed toward the beaches against the immediate requirement to avoid collisions, fires, and additional hits in a crowded anchorage zone under shell fire. The opening Allied salvos also prompted rapid responses from Japanese escorts. Destroyers and cruisers that had been screening the convoys moved to engage the intruders. Searchlights probed the darkness from several directions, attempting to illuminate Perth and Houston for gunfire. As visibility shifted under these beams, self-identification became a critical issue. Japanese ships needed to distinguish the Allied cruisers from their own transports and escorts, while both sides maneuvered at speed. The risk of misidentification was heightened by the presence of multiple columns of ships, varying speeds, and the glare of fires that had already broken out on struck vessels. On Perth and Houston, the crews reacted to this sudden multiplication of threats by shifting from an initial focus on attacking transports ahead to dealing with the emerging ring of enemy warships. Gunnery officers had to decide whether to continue firing at transports, which directly affected the landing operation, or to switch to engaging destroyers and cruisers, which posed a more immediate danger to their own ships. Torpedo crews prepared their remaining weapons, but their arcs of fire were constrained by the need to avoid hitting one another, and by the constantly changing positions of enemy and friendly ships in close waters. the Allied cruisers began to turn and zigzag in an effort to complicate enemy firing solutions while still seeking a route through the strait. The first exchange of gunfire influenced morale differently on the two sides. On the Allied cruisers, the fact that shells were landing on transports and that at least one Japanese ship appeared to be hit and burning suggested that they had achieved at least partial surprise and inflicted damage on the invasion force. This supported the belief, held by some officers and sailors, that they might disrupt the landings or force the convoy to scatter, thereby gaining space for their own escape. Among Japanese convoy commanders, the unexpected appearance of two Allied cruisers inside the defensive perimeter represented a serious tactical problem. They now had to safeguard large numbers of troops and ships in confined waters while coordinating an attack by escorts operating according to a decentralized night action doctrine. Civilian and non-combatant perspectives intersected with these early engagements only indirectly. Indonesian coastal communities near Bantam Bay observed distant gun flashes and the glow of fires at sea, but most lacked direct information about which side controlled events offshore. On Java, Dutch and other Allied civilians in Batavia and environs were already in the process of evacuation or sheltering from air raids, and did not immediately know that Perth and Houston had engaged the invasion convoy in the Sunda Strait. For them, the battle at sea would only later appear as one episode in the larger collapse of Allied control over the Netherlands East Indies. As the first phase of the engagement drew on, the tactical situation for Perth and Houston became more complex rather than clearer. They had opened fire and struck several targets, but they were now aware that they were operating inside or at the edge of a large and heavily escorted convoy in narrow waters. Japanese destroyers were closing to launch torpedoes, cruisers were bringing heavier guns into action, and the geography of the Sunda Strait limited the Allied cruisers' options for radical maneuvers. The initial attempt to transit the passage had given way to a fight for survival and for any remaining opportunity to damage the invasion force. As the engagement off Bantam Bay developed after midnight on March 1, 1942, the situation for all ships in the area shifted from limited contact to a crowded and unstable battle. Perth and Houston, having opened fire on what proved to be Japanese transports and smaller vessels, now found themselves inside a loose ring of enemy escorts. Searchlights from several directions periodically illuminated their hulls, followed by salvos from destroyers and cruisers maneuvering at varying ranges. The geography of the Sunda Strait, narrow waters bordered by the northwest coast of Java, the southeast coast of Sumatra, and islands such as Sangyeong, limited the options for wide turns and escape routes. Japanese destroyers began to implement their night fighting doctrine in practical terms. Fubuki and other screening ships launched spreads of Type 93 torpedoes, firing patterns intended to cross likely tracks of the Allied cruisers at several points. Some spreads were launched at estimated rather than precisely observed positions, due to the difficulty of maintaining visual contact with zigzagging targets amid smoke and gun flashes. These torpedoes ran through areas where transports and support vessels were also maneuvering, creating a risk not only for the Allied ships, but for the Japanese invasion force itself. Perth and Houston responded to this escalation by varying speed and course while maintaining intermittent fire at targets that could be identified. Gunnery officers alternated between engaging transports, which were still moving toward or already in Bantam Bay, and switching to destroyers or cruisers when these appeared close and illuminated. Smoke from shell hits, onboard fires, and deliberate smoke screens further reduced visibility. On Perth, reports from lookouts and rangefinders had to be reconciled quickly on the bridge to choose targets and avoid collisions, while Houston's reduced main battery was tasked with both offensive fire and defensive engagement against closing escorts. Within the convoy, the effect of the spreading battle was increasingly disruptive. Some transports already under shell fire attempted to alter course away from the direction of the Allied cruisers, even when this meant moving off planned approach routes. Others held position or reduced speed, waiting for instructions from escort commanders. At least several transports and auxiliary vessels suffered hits from shells or torpedoes, leading to fires, flooding, and casualties among embarked troops and crews. Medical personnel, already prepared for possible casualties during opposed landings ashore, now had to treat wounded men in confined compartments at sea, sometimes under conditions of darkness and smoke. For Japanese naval commanders, the crisis took the form of competing priorities. Safeguarding the convoy required driving off or sinking the Allied cruisers, but doing so in waters crowded with friendly ships imposed strict constraints on how aggressively destroyers could maneuver and fire torpedoes. Orders were transmitted to concentrate fire on the intruders while maintaining separation between screening groups and transport columns. Coordinating these actions from flagships located among the transports meant that some decisions were made with incomplete or delayed information about the precise positions of Perth and Houston. On the Allied ships, command challenges had a different character. Perth and Houston were operating without external support and with limited ammunition reserves, yet they had become the only immediate obstacle to the landing of a large invasion force in western Java. As enemy escorts closed in, both captains faced a series of rapid decisions, whether to push further west in an attempt to break clear into the strait, whether to turn south or north to seek less congested water, and how long to continue engaging transports while under increasing threat from torpedoes and converging gunfire. Damage reports from below decks, fuel state, and ammunition counts all informed these choices, but they had to be weighed against the changing tactical picture on the surface. Casualties aboard Perth and Houston began to increase as shells from Japanese destroyers and cruisers found their mark. Hits above the waterline damaged superstructures, communications equipment, and some of the secondary armament. Fragmentation and fires affected personnel at exposed stations, including gun crews and lookouts. Damage control parties moved to seal compartments, fight fires, and maintain electrical power and steering. Despite these efforts, communication between different parts of each ship increasingly relied on runners and local initiative as voice pipes and wiring were damaged. For the Japanese soldiers embarked on the transports, the escalation was experienced largely as uncertainty and confinement. Those on ships nearer the line of fire heard impacts, felt shocks from near misses, and sometimes received orders to shift to different decks or compartments to balance the ship or avoid smoke. Equipment and vehicles stowed on open decks or in holds could be damaged by splinters, fires, or flooding, complicating the later task of assembling units once ashore. Officers responsible for landing schedules had to revise plans in real time, taking into account which transports remained fully operational, which had to withdraw, and which required immediate assistance. Local populations along the nearby coasts continued to perceive the battle only through sound and distant light. Residents in villages near Bantam Bay could see the flashes of gunfire and the glow of burning ships on the horizon, but the specific identity of ships and the course of the engagement remained unclear. In the short term, the main impact on civilians came in the form of heightened movement restrictions, increased military activity along roads and beaches, and the anticipation of landings that would bring foreign troops into their communities. By approximately the middle phase of the night's fighting, the engagement had expanded beyond an initial clash between two cruisers and a few escorts into a complex confrontation involving multiple Japanese destroyers, cruisers, transports, and auxiliary vessels in restricted waters. Perth and Houston had inflicted damage on elements of the convoy, but had themselves suffered hits and faced repeated torpedo attacks. The crisis now centered on whether they could find a path out of this environment into open water, and on how much additional damage they might cause to the invasion force before their own capacity to fight or maneuver was finally exhausted. Around the midpoint of the night, the combat off the Sunda Strait reached its most intense phase. Perth and Houston, maneuvering in waters crowded with transports, escorts, and islands, were now under sustained fire from multiple directions. Japanese destroyers were closing from ahead, abeam and astern, while heavier units added their guns as opportunities allowed. The two Allied cruisers attempted to maintain a course that would move them westward toward the open strait, but each turn to evade torpedoes or avoid collisions risked bringing them back toward the center of the Japanese formation. Perth, in the lead, repeatedly altered course to comb perceived torpedo tracks, while continuing to fire at targets that could be identified through the smoke, flares, and intermittent searchlight beams. Witnesses later recalled that she engaged several destroyers at close range, using both her main 6-inch guns and smaller weapons. Despite earlier ammunition expenditure, her gunners still managed to place shells on Japanese ships, contributing to damage on some of the escorts and transports. However, the concentration of enemy fire now increasingly fell on Perth herself. She sustained multiple shell hits that affected her superstructure, gun mountings, and internal systems, gradually reducing her ability to sustain the same rate of maneuver and fire. Houston, following astern, faced a similar environment with added constraints. With only 6 operational 8-inch guns and limited ammunition, her gunnery teams had to husband shells while responding to destroyers launching torpedoes at relatively short ranges. She also took hits from enemy fire, which damaged her secondary batteries and started fires in several compartments. Nonetheless, Houston's main battery continued to engage targets when bearing allowed, and her anti-aircraft and secondary guns were employed against destroyers and other nearby ships as they appeared out of the darkness. In the Japanese formation, destroyer captains carried out repeated torpedo attacks, using patterns designed to saturate likely paths. Torpedoes crossed not only ahead of the Allied cruisers, but also through lanes where Japanese ships were attempting to reposition. In the confusion, several Japanese transports and at least one minesweeper were struck by torpedoes or caught in the crossfire, leading to losses among embarked troops and naval personnel. Later, Japanese assessments acknowledged that some of these sinkings were the result of their own torpedo spreads launched under rapidly changing conditions. Perth's situation deteriorated decisively when she was hit by a series of torpedoes in close succession. Shortly after midnight 20, at least 2 torpedoes struck her on the port side as she turned in an effort to find a way out through the strait. The impacts caused severe flooding in machinery and magazine spaces and led to a progressive loss of power and stability. With further shell hits adding to the damage, Captain Waller gave orders consistent with abandoning a ship no longer able to fight or remain afloat. Life-saving equipment was deployed where possible, and many of those still capable moved to upper decks in preparation to leave the sinking cruiser. Houston briefly continued alone as Perth's lights and gunfire diminished. For the crew of the American cruiser, the loss of their companionship underscored their isolation. Nevertheless, Captain Rooks maintained an effort to force a passage westward, steering through gaps between enemy vessels and continuing to fire when targets were visible. Japanese destroyers and cruisers adjusted their focus accordingly, directing torpedoes and gunfire at the remaining Allied cruiser. Houston took additional hits that affected her steering, propulsion, and internal communications. Despite cumulative damage, Houston's gunners reportedly continued to operate several of the main and secondary guns until ammunition stocks were nearly exhausted. Some accounts indicate that her last main battery rounds were fired at close-range targets in an effort to keep destroyers at a distance. Below decks, damage control teams attempted to contain flooding and maintain power, but each new hit increased the rate of water ingress and the number of compartments that had to be sealed or abandoned. Japanese commanders, observing the progressive damage on both Allied cruisers, weighed the need to finish the engagement against the ongoing responsibility to protect the convoy. Destroyers that had expended most of their torpedoes shifted emphasis to gunfire, while others still holding torpedoes attempted to approach for final attacks. At the same time, orders were issued to reorganize transport columns, move damaged ships out of the main traffic lanes, and prepare for landings at first light. For the personnel on both sides, the peak of the battle combined intense activity with limited situational awareness. Many Japanese soldiers on transports could hear heavy gunfire and see burning ships, but did not know which side had suffered which losses. Allied sailors leaving damaged compartments on Perth and Houston often had only partial information about the state of their own ships, and none about the broader tactical picture. The noise of explosions, the motion of ships maneuvering at high speed, and the restricted visibility of a night battle in confined waters meant that individuals experienced this phase largely through immediate tasks, serving guns, handling hoses, carrying wounded, or standing by rafts and boats, rather than through a clear understanding of how the engagement as a whole was unfolding. In the final phase of surface engagement, resistance on both sides took the form of adaptation to damage rather than purely offensive maneuver. After the multiple torpedo hits that left Perth sinking, her surviving crew shifted from shipborne combat to survival tasks in the water. Those who could reach rafts, Carly floats, or debris attempted to group together in darkness to reduce the risk of being separated by currents or propeller wash. Sailors accustomed to gunnery or engine room routines now focused on keeping themselves and wounded comrades afloat, using Kapok life jackets and any buoyant material available. Some reached Japanese ships that approached to pick up survivors, moving from one environment of discipline and orders to another as prisoners of war. On Houston, resistance continued through attempts to maintain fighting capability under rapidly deteriorating conditions. Gun crews reallocated personnel as casualties mounted, keeping as many weapons manned as possible. Ammunition parties moved shells and cartridges from magazines and ready-use lockers that were still accessible, adjusting to blocked passages or flooded spaces. In some sections, communications had broken down, and local gun captains fired on their own judgment when enemy destroyers or other ships came into view. Damage control teams adapted their procedures to repeated hits, isolating damaged parts of the electrical system, shoring bulkheads, and rerouting pumps to keep key machinery spaces functional for as long as possible. Japanese escort ships also demonstrated adaptation as the battle evolved. Destroyers that had already fired most, or all of their torpedoes, shifted to gunnery and close escort roles, taking up positions to screen damaged transports from further attack and collision. Others adjusted their firing patterns and approach angles in response to the risk of friendly hits, refining torpedo solutions to account for the increasingly irregular courses of both Allied and Japanese ships. Minesweepers and smaller craft, originally tasked with clearing channels and marking anchorages, were re-employed to assist damaged transports, fight fires, and recover men from the water after ships were hit. On board transports that had suffered damage, Japanese soldiers and crews had to reorganize both physically and administratively. Units whose equipment had been damaged in the holds or on deck began to prepare to land with reduced heavy weapons, compensating by emphasizing small arms and light support weapons in initial shore parties. Medical staff adapted landing plans to account for wounded personnel who would need immediate evacuation and treatment ashore or transfer to other ships. Officers responsible for assembling battalions and companies for the advance inland began revising orders to reflect losses suffered before reaching the beaches. For those still afloat on Allied rafts and debris, adaptation involved decisions about signaling and movement. Some groups attempted to stay near where their ship had sunk, in the expectation that Japanese escorts, having won control of the area, might recover survivors. Others tried to drift away from the main battle zone to reduce the risk of being struck by gunfire or torpedoes still being used against Houston. In all cases, individuals had to adjust quickly to cold water, oil contamination, limited flotation, and the need to ration any provisions carried on rafts. Their resistance became a matter of endurance rather than ongoing participation in the battle. Within the Japanese command structure, staff on escort flagships and transports modified their operational picture as new reports came in. Initial surprise at encountering Perth and Houston inside the convoy's perimeter was followed by a recalibration of threat assessment. Once it became clear that no additional major Allied warships were present, priorities shifted progressively from destroying the intruding cruisers to stabilizing the convoy and preparing for landings at first light. Orders were issued to reconstitute formation integrity, redistributing surviving transports among columns and adjusting landing schedules to account for ships that had been sunk or damaged. Local Indonesian crews on harbor craft and small coastal vessels, some of which had been requisitioned or impressed for military use, also adapted to the changing circumstances. Where ordered, they assisted in guiding transports and escorts into suitable anchorages or acted as auxiliary craft to help transfer personnel and equipment between larger ships. For coastal communities, adaptation meant responding to the imminent arrival of Japanese forces by preparing for possible requisitioning of buildings, food supplies, and labor based on previous experiences in other parts of the archipelago or on instructions from local authorities. Aboard Houston, the final stage of resistance involved maintaining order during the transition from combat to abandonment. As hits accumulated and list increased, officers and petty officers directed men to boat stations and rafts, balancing the need to keep essential weapons manned with the inevitability that the ship would not remain afloat. When orders consistent with abandoning ship were given, sailors and Marines moved to upper decks and over the side while under continued fire. In this environment, adaptation was expressed as adherence to drill, using ladders, nets, and ropes where intact, assisting wounded comrades to the rails, and attempting to clear the hull quickly enough to avoid being drawn down by the suction as the ship capsized and sank. By the time surface firing eased and the last major Allied resistance at sea ceased, both sides had passed through a sequence of adjustments that reflected their respective doctrines and circumstances. Japanese escorts had turned from pre-planned screening roles to direct combat and then to rescue and convoy reorganization. Allied crews had moved from an attempted breakout and opportunistic attack on transports to damage control, localized defense, and survival in the water. These adaptations did not change the overall balance of the battle, but they shaped the fates of the individuals and units involved as the engagement moved toward its conclusion, and the focus of operations shifted from the sea to the impending landings on Java. In the early hours of March 1, 1942, the turning point of the Battle of Sunda Strait occurred in rapid sequence. After Perth had been struck by multiple torpedoes and was sinking, Houston remained under concentrated attack from several directions. Japanese destroyers and cruisers, now able to focus their efforts on a single target, continued to close the range, using gunfire to further reduce her fighting capacity and additional torpedoes to ensure she could not escape into the open strait. The American cruiser, already hit repeatedly, began to take on water faster than damage control could manage. List increased, propulsion became unreliable, and sections of the ship lost electrical power, marking the transition from sustained resistance to impending loss. Shortly after midnight, further torpedo hits and internal flooding made Houston's survival impossible. As the angle of heel became pronounced, orders associated with abandoning ship were implemented more fully. Men moved toward the rails, rafts, and any remaining boats, while some continued to serve weapons as long as ammunition and stable platforms remained. When the cruiser finally capsized and slipped beneath the surface, many of those still on board entered the water within a short span of time, joining survivors from Perth, already scattered across the battle area. The sinking of Houston removed the last major Allied service combatant in the immediate vicinity and signaled the end of organized resistance at sea in this action. For Japanese commanders, this moment clarified the tactical situation. The uncertainty that had accompanied initial contact, specifically the question of whether more Allied warships might be nearby, gave way to a more definite assessment. The principal surface threat to the Western Java invasion convoy had been neutralized. Reports from destroyers and cruisers confirmed that 2 enemy cruisers had been sunk, and that no additional heavy units appeared to be present. With this information, escort leaders shifted emphasis from offensive pursuit to consolidation. Surviving escorts were reassigned to defined sectors around the convoy, and some ships began to recover men from the water where feasible. The turning point also altered the experience of Japanese soldiers embarked on the transports. During the night, many had been confined below decks while ship crews and naval personnel dealt with fire and damage risks. Once it became clear that the immediate naval threat had diminished, preparations for landing, temporarily disrupted by the battle, resumed with greater intensity. Units rechecked equipment, reorganized loading plans in light of any damaged or lost materiel, and prepared to disembark under first light conditions. The sense of uncertainty created by the unexpected appearance of Allied cruisers was replaced by a renewed focus on the planned advance onto Java. For Allied personnel in the water, the same turning point had a different character. With both Perth and Houston sunk, survival no longer depended on the outcome of an ongoing surface engagement, but on whether they would be noticed and picked up, and by whom. Groups of survivors from the 2 cruisers, along with some from damaged Japanese ships, floated amid debris and patches of fuel oil. In places where Japanese destroyers or other vessels conducted rescue operations, Allied sailors became prisoners of war. Elsewhere, men remained in the water until daylight, exposed to currents, exhaustion, and the possibility of not being found at all. At the operational level, the elimination of Perth and Houston meant that no comparably sized Allied surface force remained to interfere with the Western Java convoy's movements in the Sunda Strait. Smaller Allied vessels in other sectors faced their own engagements or attempts to escape, but the immediate sea lane through which the convoy had to pass into Bantam Bay no longer contained a pair of cruisers capable of inflicting concentrated damage. The balance of initiative at sea had shifted decisively. Japanese commanders could now proceed with landings while allocating only a fraction of their escort strength to guard against any residual threats. The geography of the area reinforced this shift. With the main Allied ships lost, the narrowness of the Sunda Strait and the proximity of islands such as Songgyang and Java's western tip now favored the invaders rather than the defenders. Escorts could patrol shorter arcs to cover approaches, and artillery from ships could, if necessary, support landings close to the coast. The same confined waters that had complicated Japanese torpedo attacks, while Perth and Houston maneuvered, now facilitated a more controlled movement of transports into designated anchorages. By the time the sky began to lighten, the contours of the turning point were clear. 2 Allied cruisers lay on the seabed, along with several Japanese transports and smaller ships damaged or sunk during the night. Japanese escorts remained in sufficient numbers and condition to cover the convoy's final approach and subsequent unloading. For the Allied side, the loss of Perth and Houston not only removed key units from the order of battle, but also confirmed that efforts to prevent or significantly disrupt the Western Java landings by surface action alone had failed. The struggle for control of Western Java was shifting decisively from the sea to the land, where garrison forces and hastily assembled defensive units would confront formations brought ashore from the very convoy the cruisers had tried to reach and disrupt in the darkness off the Sunda Strait. By the morning of March 1, 1942, organized fighting at sea in the Sunda Strait had ended, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. Japanese convoy commanders resumed systematic movement of transports into Bantam Bay and nearby anchorages. Landing craft and small boats were lowered to transfer troops of the 2nd Infantry Division and other units ashore. Despite the loss and damage suffered by several transports and auxiliaries during the night, the majority of the convoy remained operational, enabling landings to proceed largely on the original timetable. Army staff ashore began to organize columns for the advance toward key objectives in Western Java, including Merak, Serang, and ultimately Batavia. On land, Dutch and Allied commanders in Western Java received fragmentary reports of the night battle. Radio traffic and coastal observations confirmed that major Japanese landings were taking place near Bantam Bay and Merak. With the disappearance of Perth and Houston from expected reporting channels and no evidence of further Allied naval activity in the area, local defenders had to assume that sea-based resistance had been overcome. Plans for delaying actions inland, already constrained by limited numbers of troops and equipment, now had to be carried out in the knowledge that the enemy had successfully established a major bridgehead on the coast. For the crews of Perth and Houston, the immediate aftermath took the form of survival and capture. Of the roughly 680 personnel who had sailed on Perth, only a fraction reached the water alive and were subsequently picked up. Similarly, out of more than 1,000 on board Houston, many were killed in the battle or during the sinking. Survivors from both ships were gathered by Japanese destroyers and other vessels over the course of the morning and early afternoon. Once on board, they received basic medical attention according to the capacities of the rescuing ships, and were then transported to shore and onward to prisoner of war camps in Java, and, later, other parts of the Japanese-controlled empire. Conditions for these prisoners varied, but for many, the Sunda Strait marked the beginning of years of captivity. Groups of Perth and Houston survivors were eventually employed on labor projects across the region, including on railway construction and other infrastructure schemes. Their experience in the aftermath of the battle thus extended far beyond the immediate physical effects of the sinking and into an extended period in which disease, malnutrition, and hard labor became persistent threats. The fate of these men formed a significant component of the human cost of the action, parallel to the losses suffered by Japanese soldiers and sailors in damaged or sunk transports and escorts. Japanese forces also faced an immediate aftermath characterized by medical, logistical, and administrative tasks. Ships that had taken hits during the night required damage assessment, temporary repairs, and in some cases, towing or beaching. Medical teams treated wounded soldiers and sailors aboard transports, escorts, and ashore in improvised facilities near the landing beaches. Commanders had to account for units that had lost equipment or personnel before reaching land, adjusting orders for the advance inland to reflect reduced strength or altered capabilities. In some formations, companies and battalions landed under strength or with fewer heavy weapons than planned, a direct consequence of the nocturnal engagement in the strait. For local populations near Bantam Bay and along the western coast of Java, the immediate aftermath involved a rapid transition from distant battle to occupation. Within hours of landing, Japanese troops moved to secure ports, roads, and communication centers. Indonesian civilians encountered military patrols, requisitioning of buildings for headquarters and billets, and demands for supplies and labor. Dutch and Allied civilian officials in the region, many of whom had already considered evacuation impossible, now faced arrest or internment. The sounds and sights of the previous night's naval action thus gave way to the visible presence of new authorities on land. From a broader Allied perspective, the loss of Perth and Houston in the Sunda Strait was part of a sequence of reverses in the Netherlands East Indies. With these cruisers sunk and with other Allied ships damaged, scattered, or lost in related actions, the capacity to contest Japanese control of sea approaches to Java effectively vanished. Naval commands in Australia, India, and Ceylon received reports indicating that large elements of the ABDA surface fleet had been destroyed or driven off, confirming that further operations would have to be mounted from more distant bases, and with different combinations of ships and aircraft. The immediate priority became the evacuation of remaining personnel and the reorganization of surviving units into new formations in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. At the same time, Japanese naval and army staffs evaluated the results of the operation in terms of both losses and accomplishments. On the one hand, they had secured passage for a major convoy into western Java and eliminated 2 Allied cruisers that might otherwise have escaped to continue operations elsewhere. On the other, they had incurred the loss of several transports and smaller ships, along with casualties among embarked troops, in part due to torpedoes that had passed through congested waters. These outcomes informed subsequent discussions within Japanese commands about convoy spacing, night engagement procedures near large formations, and coordination between escort and transport elements. In the wider Southeast Asian theater, the immediate consequences of the battle contributed to a rapid shift in the balance of control, with Java under increasing pressure from landings in both east and west, and with Allied naval forces no longer able to intervene decisively in nearby waters. Japanese control over key sea lanes linking Malaya, Sumatra, Borneo, and the Philippines to the home islands solidified during the following weeks. The Sunda Strait, where Perth and Houston had attempted to break out, became one of several controlled passages through which shipping could move with reduced risk of major surface opposition. For individuals on all sides, the aftermath of the Battle of Sunda Strait thus combined strategic change with personal transition. Allied sailors and some Dutch personnel entered captivity. Japanese soldiers and sailors moved from transports and damaged ships into inland campaigns, and Indonesian civilians adjusted to an occupation presence shaped partly by the speed and scale with which the invasion convoys had reached their shores. The night action off the Sunda Strait had lasted only a few hours, but its immediate consequences extended across ships, camps, ports, and towns throughout western Java and beyond. In the longer view of the Pacific War, the Battle of Sunda Strait became one element in a wider sequence of events rather than an isolated episode, but its consequences were measurable at several levels. Militarily, the loss of HMAS Perth and USS Houston removed 2 cruisers that, had they escaped, could have joined Allied forces regrouping around Australia and the Indian Ocean. Their destruction, combined with earlier losses in the Java Sea, reduced the ABDA fleet from a multinational formation with several heavy units to a scattered group of survivors. In practical terms, this meant fewer ships available to escort convoys, fewer hulls for future operations, and a reduced ability to exert surface pressure near Southeast Asia in the months that followed. For the Japanese side, the successful defense of the Western Java convoy and the subsequent occupation of Java consolidated control over the Netherlands East Indies. With landings completed in both western and eastern sectors, Japanese forces gained access to oil, rubber, and other resources that their war economy required. Control of ports and airfields on Java, combined with bases in Sumatra and Borneo, strengthened the network of routes connecting Malaya, the Indies, and the Philippines to the home islands. In strategic terms, the action in the Sunda Strait formed part of a completed arc, the transition from rapid offensive operations to a new defensive perimeter built on captured territories and sea lanes. At the operational and doctrinal level, both sides drew lessons from the battle. Japanese naval discussions after the campaign noted the effectiveness of night engagements, coordinated destroyer attacks, and long-range torpedoes against enemy surface ships. At the same time, they recognized that launching torpedoes in congested waters near large convoys carried risks for their own transports and escorts. This contributed to later adjustments in convoy spacing, fire control discipline, and the positioning of screening forces relative to transport columns. Allied analyses emphasized the vulnerability of isolated cruisers operating without air cover and the challenges of coordinating multinational forces under compressed timelines and limited communications. The events of February and March 1942 influenced subsequent planning for joint commands and highlighted the importance of standardized procedures across different navies. The human legacy of the battle extended far beyond the night of combat. Many of the survivors from Perth and Houston spent years as prisoners of war, working on railways, docks, and other infrastructure projects under harsh conditions. Mortality among these prisoners was high, driven by disease, malnutrition, overwork, and limited medical care. Japanese soldiers and sailors who survived damaged transports or served on escorts also carried the memory of the battle into later campaigns, some experiencing further actions in the Indian or Pacific Oceans, others remaining on garrison or logistical duties. For Indonesian civilians, the battle marked a transition point after which Japanese authority replaced Dutch colonial administration, setting conditions for political developments that would later shape independence movements and post-war state formation. In the decades after 1945, the Sunda Strait engagement became part of national narratives in several countries. In Australia and the United States, Perth and Houston came to symbolize the final phase of resistance in the Netherlands East Indies. Memorials, unit histories, and veterans' accounts recorded the battle as an example of ships attempting to break out under unfavorable conditions and of the subsequent experiences of their crews in captivity. In Japan, the focus often lay on the broader success of the Java invasion and the temporary establishment of a resource base, while specialist studies also examined the convoy losses and the conduct of night actions. In Indonesia, remembrance was embedded in a larger story of wartime occupation, local experiences, and the eventual struggle for independence, with the Sunda Strait recognized as one of several sites where foreign navies clashed in nearby waters. Historical assessments of the battle have varied in emphasis. Some analyses stress the structural constraints under which Allied commanders operated: limited air support, fragmented intelligence, and the absence of a coherent evacuation plan for all major surface units. Others underline the tactical effectiveness of Japanese destroyer doctrine and torpedo armament, while also noting the costs imposed on their own convoy by combat within a crowded anchorage. Comparative studies place the Sunda Strait action alongside the Java Sea battle and subsequent engagements off Ceylon and in the Coral Sea, using it to trace the shift from Allied surface defeat to later stages when carrier aviation and submarines became primary tools for contesting Japanese sea control. The physical remnants of the battle have also entered its legacy. The wrecks of Perth and Houston, lying in relatively shallow waters, became sites of interest for divers, researchers, and commemorative visits by naval representatives from the countries involved. Over time, concerns about unauthorized salvage and disturbance of these wrecks, regarded as war graves, prompted discussions about protection and heritage management. Similar issues arose regarding Japanese transports and smaller ships lost in the same area, whose crews and embarked troops formed part of the total casualties of the engagement. In contemporary historiography, the Battle of Sunda Strait is often viewed less as a decisive turning point in itself than as a conclusive episode in the collapse of Allied naval power in the Netherlands East Indies and the concurrent establishment of Japanese control over critical maritime routes. Yet, When examined through the experiences of those on board the ships, in the coastal communities, and in the command centers that directed or received reports of the fighting, it offers insight into how operational decisions, material conditions, and geography interacted in a confined and time-limited setting. The night action between Perth, Houston, and the Western Java invasion convoy thus continues to inform studies of coalition warfare, convoy protection, night surface combat, and the broader dynamics of the early Pacific War, while remaining a specific historical event remembered through individual and collective acts of commemoration.